Maintenant, je vais commencer la présentation. Alors, en fait, je vais la faire en français parce que toutes les diapositives sont traduites en anglais. Hein. So, it will be in French, but all slides are in English as well. Donc, il y a 500 ans, Magellan arrive au Brunei. C'est un événement qui n'est pas célébré au Brunei. J'ai pas vu de... Ok. Le seul signe de l'arrivée de Magellan, vous connaissez, c'est à l'hôtel Empire. Une description imaginaire d'un peintre qui décrit l'arrivée de Magellan. En fait, quand on regarde bien les faits historiques, c'est assez précis. On reconnaît la rivière du Brunei, cette petite jetée ici existe, elle est derrière le musée maritime de Brunei. Vous verrez les restes en bois de cette jetée qui menait à une île artificielle construite par les Bruneiens pour observer l'arrivée des bateaux. Donc moi, je vais essayer d'abord, dans une première partie, de répondre à plusieurs questions. Quand a lieu cette expédition? D'où est-elle partie? Qui l'a financée? Qui a dirigé l'expédition? Quels étaient les objectifs de l'expédition? Avec quels moyens? Et puis, je parlerai de la première partie, d'une première découverte. Et ensuite, je passerai la parole à mes deux autres interlocuteurs. Et je finirai par les conséquences de l'expédition. Alors, l'époque, c'est l'époque de la Renaissance. C'est ce qu'on appelle le siècle des découvertes. La Renaissance, c'est entre autres une renaissance des recherches techniques et de sciences. Donc, il y a des progrès scientifiques dans tous les domaines à cette période. Alors, pour ce qui nous intéresse, la navigation astronomique, les instruments scientifiques de mesure, la construction de bateaux et l'édition de cartes marines. Voilà les 4 grands domaines qui vont nous intéresser pour l'expédition de Magellan. Donc, alors, à l'époque, la mer, c'est un endroit très très mystérieux qui fait peur. On pense que la mer est peuplée de monstres, de dragons, et les navigateurs ont peur d'aller en pleine mer. Ils vont en Méditerranée, mais la Méditerranée est entourée de terre. Méditerranée, c'est ce que ça veut dire, une mer entourée de terre. Donc ça va, mais aller vers l'océan, là, c'est beaucoup plus difficile, et je reviendrai après sur les raisons qui ont permis aux hommes d'aller sur les océans. La construction navale. À partir du 15e siècle, 14e siècle, on a un grand progrès, c'est ça, the rudder. On a un seul gouvernail qui permet de mieux diriger les bateaux. Alors qu'auparavant, depuis l'Antiquité romaine, on avait un double gouvernail et qui était beaucoup plus compliqué à manœuvrer. Il y a quelqu'un de génie qui a pensé à avoir ça. Les bateaux aussi deviennent plus gros, avec des châteaux, ça s'appelle une proue et une poue, un arrière et un avant très très haut, qui permet d'avoir une meilleure stabilité jusqu'à un certain point, et surtout d'avoir un plus gros tonnage. Alors il faut savoir qu'à la même époque, et même 100 ans avant, là nous sommes en 16e siècle, 1500, les Chinois construisent des bateaux 10 fois plus grands. One century before Magellan, Chinese could build ships that were 10 times bigger than these European ships. Donc ça c'est la caravelle. La caravelle c'est le bateau qui a été utilisé, 3 bateaux ont été utilisés par Christophe Colomb pour découvrir l'Amérique. La caraque c'est un bateau qui est un peu plus gros que la caravelle, même principe avec des châteaux très très hauts. La caraque utilise ce qu'on appelle des voiles mauresques, alors que c'est ça, c'est mal mauresque. Et ça c'est les voiles latines ou c'est l'inverse, je ne sais plus. Bref. En tout cas, ces 2 bateaux permettent de transporter beaucoup plus de choses que les bateaux du Moyen-Âge et de rester à la mer pendant très longtemps parce qu'on peut mettre dans les soutes beaucoup de vivres, d'eau, etc. Les instruments de navigation. Alors là, il y a des marins, ils pourront nous expliquer ce que c'est. Donc, le grand progrès, la boussole, le compas, qui permet de savoir où est le nord. Donc ça, c'était inventé par les Chinois. Mais les Européens, ça arrive en Europe par la Chine, par les pays arabes et ensuite par l'Espagne. Il y a ce qu'on appelle le bâton de Jacob, de Jacob's Staff. Ça sert à mesurer les angles des étoiles. En mesurant l'angle des étoiles, on sait où on se pose, où on est en mer. L'astrolabe et le quadrant sert à savoir où on se trouve en termes de latitude ou longitude. Latitude. Hein. Florent, j'ai 2 marins. I have 2 sailors, I have 2 real sailors in the room. So. Donc voilà. Alors, quand on navigue, généralement, jusqu'au XVIe siècle, on reste près des côtes. Donc, on sait où on va. Ce qui est intéressant, c'est quelle est la profondeur de l'eau, quels sont les courants, quels sont les vents, et on a toujours la terre qui est en vue. Et parce qu'on ne veut pas aller au large, parce qu'il y a des monstres. Donc, ces instruments vont permettre d'aller en pleine mer sans repère et de savoir où on se trouve. Alors, les cartes aussi, c'est quelque chose de très très important parce que jusqu'au XVIe siècle, les cartes sont surtout des portolanes. Portolane, ça vient de l'italien portolano, ça veut dire tout ce qui concerne un port. Donc sur un portulan, ça c'est l'Atlas catalan, c'est un des plus vieux portulans au monde, il se trouve à la Bibliothèque de France. Vous avez une description des côtes, et vous avez ici le texte qui dit, voilà, vous sortez du port, pendant un jour vous naviguez vers le sud, voilà la profondeur du vent, de la mer, voilà les vents, et au bout d'un jour, vous arriverez à un endroit. Donc c'est vraiment c'est comme un guide de voyage. Voilà. Un portulan de l'Afrique, et ici, un portulan, je ne sais plus, je verrai d'autres, de toute façon, je crois que c'est la Méditerranée. Voilà, ici, donc, vous savez que vous allez de ce point à ce point, de ce point à ce point, from this point to this point, this point to this point. You don't go to the open sea. Donc, les portulans, c'est l'ancêtre des cartes marines. Et à partir du XVIe siècle, on voit arriver des cartes qui permettent d'aller au large. Là, les cartes marines, donc là en revanche, on n'est plus près des côtes, on voit toute la mer, tout l'océan. Donc ça, c'est un atlas de 1506 qui a été utilisé par Magellan. De même que celui-là, Miller, c'était un cartographe des Pays-Bas allemand. Et c'est le nord de l'Atlantique. Ici, vous voyez la France, l'Espagne, l'Afrique. Ici, on ne sait pas trop ce que c'est l'Arctique, mais Pierre nous dira ce que c'est. Et ici, c'est le Brésil. Ce que l'on connaît du Brésil en 1519. 1519, donc on est 30 ans après la découverte de l'Amérique par Christophe Colomb. Les cartes sont des instruments de navigation très très importants, stratégiques, secrets, parce qu'un pays qui a une carte précise peut naviguer très loin. Et donc il peut le faire alors que d'autres pays ne pourront pas. Donc les cartes ont une très 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 grande valeur. Ce sont en même temps des instruments... moi j'aime beaucoup les cartes. C'est un instrument historique et c'est en même temps une œuvre d'art. Si vous voulez voir des belles cartes marines, vous allez chez Michael Lim from Frame. He has the largest collection of all maps in Brunei, maps of Asia, of China, of Southeast Asia and of Borneo Island. Donc voici un portulan, donc d'Espagne et du Portugal. Donc vous voyez très bien, pour le portulan, ça sert, on a tous les noms des ports sur la côte du Portugal, sur la côte d'Espagne, et la direction alors, il y a les mots détaillés, mais la direction des vents, et donc donc Magellan fait l'expédition part d'Espagne. Pourquoi l'Espagne? Parce que, donc d'Europe, à cette époque, les pays européens, les nations européennes sont les plus grandes puissances maritimes du monde connu, et surtout les deux premières sont l'Espagne et le Portugal. Ce sont les deux premières nations. Même si des marins comme Christophe Colomb, qui vient d'Italie, ou Magellan, qui est portugais, de toute façon, la plupart des expéditions sont financées par l'Espagne et le Portugal. D'autres pays comme l'Angleterre, la France, les Pays-Bas, et aussi les républiques comme Venise ou Gênes, envoient des bateaux partout dans le monde. Donc, il faut comprendre, c'est que l'histoire que moi je vais présenter, c'est une histoire qui est vue de l'Europe. C'est une histoire européo-centrée. C'est pour ça que je suis content d'avoir mes deux collègues philippins, parce qu'eux, ils vont nous montrer une vision asiatique, une vision des Philippines de cette découverte. On dit Christophe Colomb a découvert l'Amérique. Christophe Colomb est européen et découvre un continent que l'Europe ne connaît pas. Mais les Américains, les indigènes, les Native Indians qui vivent en Amérique, ils ont déjà découvert l'Amérique. On a par exemple, on va parler de Tahiti, de Hawaï, ou d'autres îles. Ces îles sont découvertes par les Européens, mais naturellement, elles ont déjà été découvertes par d'autres peuples. Qui finance? Donc, comme je l'ai dit, l'Espagne et le Portugal sont les deux grandes puissances. Et à partir du moment où Christophe Colomb découvre l'Amérique, l'Espagne et le Portugal se disent les nouvelles terres nous appartiennent. Mais le problème, donc, conflit, et le conflit est arbitré par le pape. Donc d'abord, Magellan va voir le roi du Portugal. Le roi du Portugal, pour diverses raisons, refuse de financer cette expédition. Il y a toujours cette rivalité. Et cette rivalité se traduit par le traité de Tordesillas. Tordesillas, c'est un traité qui est arbitré par le pape. Et le pape dit, tout ce qui se trouve... Alors il y a deux traités, un en 93 et un en 94. Ce qui nous intéresse, c'est ce traité de 1894. Tout ce qui est à l'est, à droite de cette ligne, qui sera découvert par des navigateurs, appartient au Portugal. Tout ce qui est à l'ouest, donc à gauche, appartient à l'Espagne. Voilà le traité. Et quand Magellan obtient un financement de Charles Ier, qui deviendra le grand empereur Charles Quint, il est dit qu'il navigue au nom de l'Espagne. Donc ça veut dire que toutes les terres qu'il va trouver qui vont dépasser l'ouest de cette ligne vont appartenir à l'Espagne. Donc ça c'est très très important parce qu'il y a une rivalité entre l'Espagne et le Portugal qui va avoir de grandes conséquences sur l'expédition de Magellan. Voilà une carte utilisée par Magellan. C'est une carte qui date un peu avant son voyage, où on voit bien cette ligne de séparation, qui est une ligne de longitude, entre ici ça appartient au Portugal, ici ça appartient à l'Espagne. Ici il y a Capo Verde, c'est une île dont on parlera, qui appartient au Portugal. Ici il y a d'autres pays comme Angola et tout, ce sont des colonies portugaises du fait du traité de Tordesillas. Et ici c'est un petit morceau du Brésil qui est bien une colonie portugaise. Voilà une autre vue d'une carte utilisée par Magellan. Donc cette carte, c'est le monde connu en 1520. Donc on connaît l'Afrique, parce qu'on a déjà fait le tour de l'Afrique, le cap de Good-Espérance, le cap de Bonne-Espérance, the Cape of Good Hope. On reconnaît ici l'Inde. Là, c'est l'Asie, on ne sait pas trop. Il y a les Philippines par là, mais on ne le sait pas. Nobody knows, but the Philippines are there. Ici, on revient à la péninsule arabique, et puis l'Europe qu'on connaît très très bien. On reconnaît la Grèce, l'Italie. On connaît un peu le Brésil, un peu ici. Tout ce qui est là, on ne connaît pas. Donc Magellan, avant de partir, recueille toutes les cartes, les meilleures cartes, les plus précises, connues de l'époque pour faire son voyage. Donc à l'époque, je vais en parler après, mais ce qui intéresse Magellan, c'est les épices. Il y avait deux moyens pour aller aux épices. Il y a la route terrestre, on passe par l'Arabie, ensuite on prend le bateau, on traverse l'océan Indien et on arrive ici aux Moluques. Et l'autre route, à partir de Christophe Colomb, c'est on traverse jusqu'au Mexique, on traverse à pied, et ensuite, on ne connaît pas encore ici, mais en tout cas on navigue ici. Et voilà le commerce à l'époque, avant que Magellan ne parte. Donc Magellan, c'est un marin, c'est aussi un explorateur, un navigateur, un soldat. Alors il est portugais, mais comme je l'ai dit, son expédition est financée par le roi du Portugal, par le roi d'Espagne. Donc ça veut dire que pendant toute l'expédition, les marins espagnols vont considérer, ils ne sont pas contents d'être dirigés par un Portugais, donc ils vont le considérer comme un imposteur. Et les Espagnols qui sont, et les Portugais qui sont à bord vont le considérer comme un traître. Donc vous voyez, déjà dès le départ, il y a des problèmes au sein de l'équipage, au sein des capitaines. Magellan, un traître pour les Portugais, un imposteur pour les Espagnols. Cela dit, il connaît bien la région, il a participé avec les expéditions financées par le roi du Portugal à des expéditions à Goa, à Malacca. Il a participé à la prise de Malacca en 1511. Donc il connaît la région. Et il sait que dans cette région, il y a les îles des Moluques, qui sont les îles des épices. Voilà. Alors les objectifs, je l'ai dit, ce sont les épices. Les épices, à l'époque, au Moyen-Âge, c'est aussi important que l'or ou le pétrole. Parce qu'à l'époque, dans la cuisine européenne, on met beaucoup d'épices. D'abord, ça donne du goût, et puis surtout, il n'y a pas de réfrigérateur à l'époque. La viande, parfois, sent un peu mauvais. Donc en mettant beaucoup d'épices, on tue les bactéries et on a un meilleur goût. Voilà, donc l'épice permet de gagner beaucoup d'argent. Donc pour un armateur, financer une expédition, ça coûte très cher, mais si le bateau revient, il est sûr d'être remboursé. Donc l'objectif, c'est d'aller aux Moluques. Hein, et l'objectif, c'est ça, en fonction du traité de Tordesillas. Donc l'expédition, rapidement, il y a 5 bateaux, donc 5 caracs. Ça, c'est une reproduction de Trinidad, non, de la Victoria, qui est le bateau qui va faire le tour du monde. Ça, c'est le bateau qui est commandé par Magellan. Et ces 3 autres bateaux sont plus petits et de toute façon, comme le Trinidad, ne reviendront pas. On l'appelle l'Armada de Molucca, donc the Fleet of the Moluques. 270 hommes d'équipage, donc il y a le capitaine, plusieurs capitaines, un par bateau, des marins, des mousses, des charpentiers, tous les corps de métier. Hein, il faut de tout pour avoir un bateau. Il y a aussi un servant, mais je laisserai Christopher parler. You talk about the servant. Enrique is his name. And, alors il y a toute l'Europe est là. Hein, il y a une centaine d'Espagnols, dont 29 Basques, 40 Portugais, 29 Italiens, 17 Français. Et le reste, ce sont voilà, un peu tous les pays d'Europe, Grèce, Pays-Bas, Irlande. Et il y a quelqu'un qui nous intéresse, qui est un Italien, parmi les 29, qui est un universitaire, scholar. C'est quelqu'un qui parle beaucoup de langues, qui sait écrire, qui sait dessiner. Et c'est lui, du départ jusqu'à la fin, il sera un des survivants. Tous les jours, il va écrire le journal de l'expédition, the Journal of the Magellan Expedition. Voilà le journal. Il y a 4 exemplaires, c'est en italien et en français. Un exemplaire aux États-Unis, un exemplaire à Paris. Les 2 autres exemplaires, je crois qu'il y en a en Espagne. Et un autre, je crois, à Rome. Donc, le journal de Pigafetta. Et ici, c'est justement les îles des Moluques, Molucca. On trouve ce livre voilà, en français, en anglais, en italien. Et tout. Donc, première étape, traverser l'Atlantique. C'est un long voyage. Donc, il y a cette carte qui permet de savoir à peu près où c'est. Et le but, c'est d'aller au sud de l'Atlantique et à partir de là, d'atteindre les Moluques. On pense que si on traverse, après quelques semaines de navigation, on va atteindre les Moluques. C'est très long. Comme il y a des Espagnols, des Portugais, il y a des luttes, il y a des mutineries, il y a des gens qui sont exécutés. Il y a un bateau, le San Antonio, qui revient vers l'Espagne 1 an à peu près après le début de l'expédition. Il y a un bateau qui est perdu en mer. Ils vont rester plusieurs mois au sud de ce qui est maintenant l'Argentine pour hiverner parce que le temps est très mauvais. Et ils cherchent donc un passage vers les Moluques, un passage qui est vers ici. Et ils vont mettre beaucoup de temps à le trouver, après cet hivernage de 3 mois. Et finalement, ils vont réussir à le trouver donc, en 1520. Donc on est à peu près 1 an après le début du voyage. Ils vont mettre à peu près 1 mois pour traverser ici. Ils voient des feux sur les montagnes. Donc ils appellent cette terre la Terra de Fuego, la terre de feu. Ils vont chercher, ils vont revenir en arrière et tout. Ça va prendre beaucoup de temps. Et alors voilà le dessin du détroit de Magellan. Donc on va l'appeler le détroit de Magellan. Le dessin par Pigafetta. C'est assez précis. On reconnaît bien les bras de mer. Et ça, c'est plus récent, c'est 100 ans plus tard. Tierra de Fuego, Américain, on ne sait pas trop où c'est. Et là, cet océan, on ne l'a pas encore nommé, mais ça va être nommé par Magellan. Quand ils arrivent au bout d'1 mois, alors il faut savoir qu'on est, je ne sais plus quelle latitude, là on doit être au 55, hein, oui, 55 à peu près, ouais. On est très au sud. Il fait très froid. Il y a il y a des tempêtes de neige, tempêtes de glace, il y a beaucoup de vagues. C'est très très difficile. Et quand elles arrivent ici, pendant 3 mois, il n'y a plus de vent. Il y a plus de vent, c'est très calme. Et donc ils appellent cette mer qu'ils découvrent une mer pacifique. Donc le nom Pacifique est donné par justement l'expédition de Magellan. Après plusieurs mois de tempête, ils arrivent dans cette mer qui est donc très très calme. Donc ils vont traverser le Pacifique, donc qu'ils appellent à l'époque Mar del Sur, the Sea of the South. Après on l'a appelé Mar Pacifico. Voilà, ça c'est une carte, vous voyez, qui date juste 2 ans après. C'est même pratiquement l'année de l'arrivée de Magellan. La VOC, c'est la Compagnie des Indes orientales des Pays-Bas. It's a map for the Netherlands. Donc, ils vont naviguer par... D'abord, ils vont remonter comme ça, et ensuite, ils vont aller plein ouest. Mais ça va prendre 3 mois. Ils pensaient que ça ne prendrait que quelques semaines, ça prend 3 mois. Du coup, ils n'ont pas assez de vivres, ils n'ont pas assez d'eau. Là, je cite Pigafetta, we drank water that was yellow and stinking. Ils n'ont pas de vivres, donc ils mangent de la sueur, ils mangent du bois, ils mangent leur ceinture, ils mangent des rats. Et ça dure 3 mois. Il y a des morts, ils souffrent du scorbut, they suffer from scurvy, because at that time they didn't know that we need to eat fresh fruits or lemon or oranges, but nobody knew at that time. Donc ils souffrent. Ils trouvent 2 îles par ici, 2 îles où il n'y a pas d'eau, il n'y a pas d'animaux, il n'y a pas de végétation, il n'y a rien, c'est que du caillou, donc ça ne sert à rien. Ils auraient navigué un peu plus au nord, ils auraient trouvé des îles, mais ils ne trouvent pas. Et au bout de 3 mois, ils vont trouver une île. Voilà. Et là, je passe la parole à qui? Yo? Non. Dans la suite de l'histoire, ça sera avec l'ambassadeur des Philippines, mais d'abord, je vais passer la parole à Rommel.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share some thoughts tonight. I'll focus on the what was the region, what was Southeast Asia that was found by Magellan when he arrived. So I'll be talking primarily about that kind of context. And my approach will be thematic. I'm going to identify a number of themes that can help us understand this episode in history. I'll be focusing on the region, but because what was happening in Southeast Asia was an extension or a reflection of what's happening elsewhere, so I'll be talking as well about what's happening beyond the region. So the first thing I'd like to talk about was the emerging global history. Before this time, different civilizations had more or less separate developments. There were, of course, interactions, but these interactions, like for example, the Silk Road linking China and Roman Empire, for example, these are still pretty limited to a particular part of the world, which is mainly Eurasian world. So we have 4 major key centers: Middle East, Europe, China, and India. In these different centers, they operated more on the based on the logic that was largely internal to itself. There were, of course, influences coming from the outside, but significantly less than what was happening within. So we have here a history of the world that is happening along the parallel lines. So when we talk about history of the world, we're talking essentially about histories of various civilizations. There's no unified engine that we can consider as to be driving the historical transformation in a global scale. So the so-called global history, the kind of history that operates on a global scale, will start to happen during this time. 16th century, we will see here the emergence of this kind of global history, and Southeast Asia plays a very significant role in the incipient stages of this global history. It is in this region where different major civilizations, religious, political, cultural, will converge. And it is in this convergence that global history will emerge. So we easily talk about globalization today, this time. And this kind of globalization, the process whereby different forces coming together, converging, and creating this kind of impulses and impacts on different parts of the world, we can trace it back to this time. And Magellan's voyage was essentially part of this transformation. So, yeah, we take a look at this map, 16th century, we shows here global, those kind of trading networks that span different parts of the world. And I'd like to point out here, that Southeast Asia, this region, we can see here, those big red lines constitute, they refer to the major nodes of global trade. And we can see in Southeast Asia, some of this pass through, some of the most important of this pass through this region. So location is one of the most important factor that will help us explain the importance of the region. And at the same time, that kind of importance is demonstrated by the very fact what drove Magellan and other voyagers to look for the Spice Islands. So their effort to find the fabled Spice Islands in this region is driven by things that they needed during the time, and this voyage will demonstrate it forms part of that kind of convergence of the process happening in this region. So the region is at the crossroads of international trade. And this region straddles along one of the busiest nodes, as I earlier mentioned. Now, there is this kind of long tradition of active participation of this region to trades. Trades in the Indian Ocean, for example, has been ongoing for centuries earlier. So this kind of trading is not happening only in the 15th, 16th centuries. It goes far back. And Southeast Asia, being located in this very important node, has been an active participant in this kind of commerce. So for long-standing role, Arabs and the other Muslim traders, particularly those coming from India, this is a long-standing pattern in history. And what set the 16th century apart is the pace, the very remarkable quickening of this kind of process, whereby the volume of trade increased significantly, the participants as well are increasing. So you would see here a truly global history emerging through this kind of interaction. And one scholars rightly referred to this period as the age of commerce. And this commerce will determine the course of world history in the succeeding decades. So you see here, Muslim Indian traders are main participants, the Chinese traders, including those who were Muslims, European traders, Magellan's voyage and other succeeding voyages will see the Europeans participating in this long-standing tradition of trade. So yeah, we've already mentioned earlier this kind of exports, pepper, cloves, nutmeg, mace, cinnamon, and aromatic woods, and all of these kind of things that will prove to be very valuable. And imports include Indian textiles, silver, weapons, and etc. So another theme that I'd like to highlight is the transformation of the religious landscape. We see here the process of Islamization. I'd like to point out, particularly in the process of Islamization, because a lot of things that will happen upon the arrival of the Western explorers will have to do with the fact that they have found in this part of the world flourishing Islamic empires. And I'd like to point particularly notable sultanates like Pasay, Malacca, Aceh, Johor, Banten, all these kind of sultanates. And Islamic influences by this time has reached as far north as Mindanao and Luzon. So by the time Magellan accidentally found the Philippines, there were already the influence of Muslim or Islamic influences have already reached that part. And I'd like to point out as well the fact that the rise of Islamic empires like the Ottomans, particularly the capture of Constantinople, Egypt, Arabia during this time, and the rise of the Mughals in India, that will last and for the next 3 centuries. All of this point to the fact that we are seeing here the rise of civilization that Christians, the Europeans, would see as a threat to their existence, and with the coming of the Spaniards in the Philippines, that was facilitated by the train of events that started with Magellan's voyage, we will see here the confrontation that earlier happened in Europe. You would see here being replicated in this part of the world. And this kind of development will color the way how the relationship between different groups within the region in the succeeding centuries. Oh, sorry. So, in a sense, the 15th, 16th century Southeast Asia that was found by Magellan's voyages, this is in the cusp of change. There is a changing balance of power happening at this time, or it started to happen during this time. For so long, the Indians, Chinese, Arabs dominated the trade in the region. And we can see indigenous empires like the Hindu-Buddhist Majapahit, Islamic Malacca, Pasay and Demak, they're still flourishing during this time, particularly Demak and Mataram and Aceh. They would rise to prominence during this period, okay, in the succeeding century. So Europeans were by no means dominant. When they came to this region, they are just one of those small players. Okay, an important player, but nevertheless, in comparison with others, the Europeans were by no means the most important factors. They are inserting themselves within the long-standing trade and polities that proved to be formidable in many ways. Of course, there are instances when we see that, for example, the capture of Malacca in 1511. This will signal that the Europeans will be a power to reckon with. But it will take some time before this kind of shifting balance of power will really be realized. And that will be about late 1600s, early 1700s. So it will take some time before that tilting of balance will eventually be completed. So this is the time, some kind of last jura of the traditional order. for so long, it's a tributary system that determined the way how in international relations were happening. So an example of this, for example, was the ties between China and Malacca was very close during the time. So China had tributary relations with many of these places in the region, and it was sought after as a protection for their own interest. And they believed many of these kind of empires, indigenous empires, they felt the need to establish that kind of relations. They visited China. They wanted to get their support. And so you would see here that this is the way how they dealt with each other. And this is going to be the fall of Malacca in particular would signal a different way of doing things. When the Europeans would occupy a particular territory and they would claim it their own, okay, something that was not done before, even by the most powerful nations like, for example, China. So when China, Genus Expeditions, for example, happened in early 1400s, it is to establish tributary relations. So there's not the idea of colonizing, occupying, controlling, owning was not like that. But this is this is a time when this kind of traditional order would see its last of this kind of things would happen, because there's going to be a change in the way how things would be run. So traditional order also was characterized by pre-capitalist trading practices. A lot of things were exchanged. There was, of course, use of currencies or silver and other things in exchange for that. So it's no longer extensively barter, but still remains within the pre-capitalist mode. And this is going to change, particularly when the Dutch succeeded in developing practices that would eventually form part of the capitalist system. So we see here the non-fixed boundaries within territories. Okay, there is this kind of in the so-called mandala fashion, the territories tend to expand or contract depending on the efficacy of the center, the leaders, to hold things together. So the moments when the leader or the particular dynasty had proven to be weak and ineffective, this kind of boundaries contracted. But at the time when they were really flourishing, powerful, effective, you would see here expanding. So these boundaries, the definition of national boundaries that will be demarcated quite fairly clearly, it would start with the coming of the Europeans. So, and also I'd like to point out this kind of non-fixed boundaries is also, you see here, that kind of shared histories. And I'd like to refer to the case of Enrique Malacca, for example, who served as the interpreter, and he used this kind of the fact that he could converse with people in Cebu, for example, indicated that Malay was a widely spoken language, some kind of a lingua franca within this time. Okay, and as some kind of a footnote to that, in contrast to what would happen eventually, because Enrique Malacca, the Malacca is considered as possibly the first to circumnavigate the world. So Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines were fighting for the ownership of Enrique Malacca. Was Enrique really Malay, or was he a Filipino, or Sumatran or Indonesian?
Tonight he's Filipino.
That's right.
Malay.
Yeah.
Malay? Okay.
So yeah, so that kind of thing. Today we're fighting for these three countries are fighting for the ownership of that. During the time, there was no need for that. Okay, people in this region, they share the language, they share this kind of cultural tradition, and they didn't care that much about this kind of demarcation. Okay, this is another thing I'd like to point about the new mindset and rules of the game. yeah, ownership of land, for example. Before this notion of ownership, people owning the land or a group of people owning the land in a way that is held for perpetuity, this will become the change in the land ownership brought about by colonialism will determine the way how things would go in the next centuries. So you see, the mercantilistic and capitalistic capitalism in itself is a new rule of the game, something that was quite alien to the region, and this will be the last time when a lot of things will happen with the introduction of this kind of system. And at the bottom line of all this, you would see as 1500s to 1600s wore on, we would see the increasing loss of ability of the region or different groups in the region to chart their own destiny. Before, they quarrel among themselves, they set the agenda, they set the rules, but that would be the last century that is going to happen. As the Europeans would come and they prove to be more capable, militarily and economically speaking, things will really change. Some concluding thoughts. Okay, so when this kind of opportunity arise for me to have this kind of to talk about remembering Magellan's voyage, I was wondering why indeed we remember Magellan's expedition. For what purpose we're doing this and for whom? So that kind of feeling of ambivalence in me. If we're going to remember Magellan's expedition, how are we going to do it? Are we going to be celebratory about the fact that Magellan did this kind of expedition? Or are we going to be, for example, in the Philippines, because Magellan was the So Lapu-Lapu, the one who killed Magellan, is of course the hero. Okay, and the tenor of Ambassador Montero will be talking about more about this, but the tenor of celebration is to celebrate the anti-colonial, the capability of Philippines to defend themselves. And I was wondering as well, okay, if we're going to do that, would it be, that means we're celebrating the death of a person, Magellan. So I was rather raising some kind of moral dilemma in that kind of thing. So how exactly we're going to remember this kind of 500 years after the expedition? Why are we doing this? For what purpose? For whom are we doing this? So those kind of questions visited my mind. Now I was thinking, one way perhaps that we can focus on celebrating this kind of occasion is to focus on as we see this expedition really encountered so many difficulties. Okay, so that kind of, if you are weak-hearted, this kind of expedition would have not prospered. Okay, somebody with the tenacity of Magellan could do something like this. And so this I've thought of this kind of that this demonstrates that kind of can-do spirit of humanity as a whole. So it represents the start, or I mean the incipient modern mindset being born. We can see in this particular voyage, among other voyages that really, but because it is really particularly very difficult, crossing to the Pacific for the first time, and the difficulty of this voyage is demonstrated by the fact that the succeeding voyages, 3 or 4 more that came soon after this, 3 of them did not make it. 1 made it back, but much less survivors than this one. So you would see, even after there was already a model to follow, there was already this kind of chart to follow, it proved that Pacific Ocean was really very extremely difficult to traverse. So given this kind of nature of this kind of expedition, we can see that this idea that human beings can do things and they can chart their own history, they can create their own fate. So that's at the core of the modern mindset. And this kind of mindset will define the way how things will run in the next couple of centuries up to now. So in that sense, we can possibly commemorate Magellan's expedition along this line. Okay, so this expedition formed a wide array of new things to transform the region in the world, for better or for worse. Okay, because there's always this kind of, it reminds me of the celebration, for example, the bicentenary of the arrival of Europeans in Australia way back in 1988. It caused a lot of debates, a lot of conflict. The same with the centenary of Columbus expedition in 1992, for example. So there always this kind of case that one group would celebrate it for a particular purpose, but another group would say, hey, wait, this is the moment when indigenous civilizations in the Americas, for example, or the indigenous people in Australia, their culture, their people were decimated. So why are we remembering this kind of thing? So always this kind of ambivalence, always a kind of things that for some group, this is a good thing to do, but for others, it's a painful one. So, and on that note, I'd like to end my presentation. Thank you very much.
Voilà. Et donc, moi, j'en étais resté à Magellan. Après 3 mois, ils traversent l'Atlantique. Ils ont faim, ils ont soif. Et ils ont trouvé 2 îles où il n'y avait rien. Et finalement, au bout de 3 mois, ils trouvent une île. Christopher.
Merci beaucoup. I'm sorry, that's the only French phrase I know. So, well, first of all, Christian, thank you very much for allowing us two non-French speakers, to deliver a lecture here at Alliance. And also thank you very much for this initiative, of having a lecture. We'll be having another lecture tomorrow at the UBD. I kept a timer actually of the two previous speakers. It's about 45 minutes, and they spoke extemporaneously. So in my case, just to be able to make sure that I keep on time limit, I'll be reading from my notes. I have 40 slides, so that will be about 40 minutes as well. Anyway, my presentation today will focus on the important episode of the first circumnavigation of the world by the Armada de Maluco, or the so-called Magellan Elcano expedition, when they reached the group of islands that now form part of present-day Philippines. In particular, I will venture to describe the local context as well as the national consequences of the voyage for the Philippines 500 years hence. This is the outline of my presentation. Firstly, I believe that it's important to note that any effort to reconstruct the past would inevitably encounter challenges and obstacles, particularly as regards accuracy and objectiveness, because perhaps this is the nature of history itself, as a discipline. Whatever happens, when an event happens, it can be interpreted or explained in many ways. Remember the saying that history is written by the victorious and for the victorious. Next, I will take you through the local setting prior to the arrival of the Magellan voyage to the islands that now comprise the Philippines. As you have seen in the presentation of Dr. Rommel, there were already many external events and external factors that have contributed to the gradual development of linkages between various settlements in the Philippines with the rest of the region through trade, as well as the expansion of the spheres of influence by powerful empires and religions in the region. Thirdly, I will present to you the discovery, quote unquote, by the Magellan Elcano voyage of the islands that now form part of the central Philippines, what the crew encountered as recorded by the Italian chronicler Antonio Figafetta. And fourth, present-day Filipinos want to add drama to their stories. So I will be sharing with you a historic episode of the voyage called the Battle of Mactan, where Magellan met his unfortunate death against the forces of a local chieftain named Lapu-Lapu. And finally, as an epilogue, I will share some insights on the significance of the first recorded circumnavigation of the globe to the Philippines and its consequences on the history and destiny of Filipinos as a people. First, unlike Europe, the Middle East, and other old civilizations like China, where there is an abundance of primary sources for writing history, there is unfortunately a scarcity of primary sources and written materials about the Philippines before Spain colonized the country. For the voyage of Magellan in the Philippines, we only rely on the account of Antonio Pigafetta and a few other crew members who survived the voyage. There are no written first-hand accounts from the natives whom they encountered in the Philippines. So it's mostly the Pigafetta account that became the basis of secondary and tertiary sources about this important episode of the expedition. And this has a bearing on the historical accuracy because we only get to hear one side of the story, mainly the European perspective, without taking into account the version of those whom they met during the voyage. Factual objectivity and completeness in narrating a particular event is also a challenge because the writer may have his own bias, may have intentionally omitted some important episodes, or may interpret or explain an event based towards a targeted audience. And so in essence, these are the pitfalls of writing history or in giving a presentation about a historical event. This is the Philippines today on your right. The slide will show you the geographical territory of the Philippines. On the left side, as shown together with the rest of Asia. And on the right side, a country map divided in three main regions, the island of Luzon in the north, the islands of the Visayas in central Philippines, central part, and the island of Mindanao in the south. And what was the Philippines like in the 1500s? There was no Philippines yet, as a country or as a nation state. Nor was there a group of people who considered themselves as Filipinos at that time. Because at that time, prior to the arrival of the Magellan voyage, the Philippine archipelago was a collection of diverse settlements and political entities who put primacy on alliance networking rather than territorial conquest in expanding political power. And because of its geographical nature as an archipelago, a human settlement in one island is basically autonomous or independent from another. However, there were already some sort of consolidation of control and power in certain regions, as you can see in this slide. On the left side, you see the Bruneian Empire, which was at its height in the Philippines during the reign of Sultan Bolkiah in the 1400s to the 1500s. As such, you will notice that in the southern part of the Philippines, there are some sultanates who have embraced Islam as their religion. Islam was first established in the Philippines in 13 AD, also through Muslim traders. And as you see here, there are also settlements that were influenced by Hinduism from India, and they are called Rajanates, as well as from China, mainly through Chinese traders. These external influences in native societies were largely brought about by the heightened contact with India, with the Arabs, with the Chinese, with Brunei and neighboring regions. Before 1521, there was already a flourishing regional maritime trade as presented to us by Dr. Rommel. And the major settlements that benefited from this bustling trade relations were the present-day territory of Manila, here, Cebu, Mindoro, Mindanao, among others, which have developed as major entrepot or places where goods are imported and redistributed to secondary trading centers. I said in my first part of our presentation that written sources are scarce prior to the arrival of Spain in the Philippines. But you know, in 1989, this copper plate, no, was found in the province of Laguna, south of Manila, which, according to anthropologists, is an inscription written in Old Malay using a kawi script with Sanskrit and Old Javanese influences. No? This inscription bears a date corresponding to April or May 900 AD. And the text notes the acquittal of all the descendants of a certain honorable Namuaran from a debt granted by a military commander of Tondo, which is in present-day Manila, and witnessed by leaders of places located in the island of Luzon. And it also makes reference to the Midang Kingdom of modern-day Indonesia, which implies, again, the political connections with territories elsewhere in Southeast Asia. When the Spaniards colonized the Philippines, they noted the existence of a native system of writing called Baybayin, which are derived from Brahmic scripts of India. But because of the imposition of Latin or Roman alphabet by the Spaniards during their 333-year rule in the Philippines, this system of writing became dormant. No? But efforts to revive and promote its use are now being made to highlight our pre-colonial culture. And again, as a result of the heightened linkages with other cultures in Asia before the Magellan voyage, the Filipino language has been influenced by other languages in the region, one of which is the Indian language. And as you can see here, there are some Filipino words that are derived from the Indian language. And of course, it is well known that there are a lot of similar words in Malay and Tagalog, no? Including other regional languages in the Philippines, as you can see in this slide. That's why it's easy and fast for Filipinos here in Brunei to learn and speak how to speak Malay. No? I think except me, I'm able to learn it. No? And you would be surprised, no? In the Philippines, we have about 120 to 187 distinct languages spoken across the country. No? These are not dialects, but totally different languages, no? Which attest to the fact that communities and societies have developed their own set of culture over time, predating the arrival of Magellan in the Philippines. In fact, in my own province, the neighboring town speaks another language that is totally different from mine, from my own native language. So when we converse with each other, we would either speak in Filipino, which is based in Tagalog, or in English, which are the lingua franca of the Philippines. In the golden age of the Bruneian Empire, during the reign of Sultan Bulkiah from 1485 to 1524 AD, written studies reveal that Brunei's territories encompass the whole of Borneo, including a wide region of present-day Philippines that covers the island of Mindanao in the south, island of Palawan in central Philippines, and as far north as the island of Luzon in Silodong. This is where present-day Manila is now. No? With Brunei as a regional center of trade, it also became a center for the propagation of Islam in the archipelago. And when the Spaniards started to colonize in the Philippines, 50 years in Cebu in 1565 and 5 years later in Manila in 1571, they found that there was already a close relationship between Brunei and other major settlements. In particular, the Spaniards noted that the ruling families in Manila, such as Raja Sulaiman, Raja Matanda, Lakandula, not only have had family connections and kinship with the sultans of Brunei, but that they also originated from Borneo. And based on oral traditions, it has been written that during the reign of Sultan Bulkiah, he married a daughter of a certain Datu Gamban, who was the ruler of Silodong in Luzon. So there is that blood relations between our two countries. Now we come to the main part of my presentation. This map shows again the circumnavigation route of the Armada de Molucca. Some textbooks wrongly depicted that the purpose of Magellan's arrival in the Philippines was to invade and colonize the country, but the actual purpose of this voyage was to prove that the Earth is not flat, by circumnavigating that world traveling westward to get to the east. I included this slide just to put faces into the names. On the left side, of course, that's Magellan. And on the right side is Juan Sebastian Elcano, who took over after Magellan's death in the Battle of Mactan and who completed the voyage back to Spain. You will see here in this slide the route of the voyage, from the present-day Guam, here, on the way to the islands that now form part of central Philippines. Then they went to Brunei, and then from Brunei, went back to Palawan, and then to Mindanao, until they finally reached the Moluccas or the Spice Islands here. According to Pigafetta, the first significant landmass that they cited in the dawn of 16 March 1521, 500 years ago, was the island of Samar here. This is now the present-day province of Samar. And just as a side story, the first island cited by the Magellan expedition is the same island where the Super Typhoon Haiyan, one of the strongest ever cyclones or typhoons recorded in history, made its first landfall in the Philippines in November 2013, a month when the central part of the Philippines are usually visited by typhoons. And it was perhaps providential that Magellan and his crew arrived in the Philippines during the month of March, which is usually the dry season. Otherwise, if they reached this region during the rainy season, Magellan would not have called the vast Pacific Ocean as Mar Pacifico, or as ocean so calm and tranquil. Pigafetta said that when the expedition reached another island called Suluan, they saw and tried to approach the natives who were aboard two canoes, but that the natives avoided them. And so, they proceeded to the island of Homonhon, where they had their first encounter with the locals. According to Pigafetta, the locals openly welcomed them with joy, bartered goods, and had a good conversation with a promise to return with more supplies for the crew. Some historians describe this act of magnanimity by the natives as a revival of the lives and fortunes of the expedition, mainly because the crew had been depleted. So many have already died. Many are sick and starving from almost 4 months of braving the Pacific Ocean. Magellan stayed here for about a week from 17 March to 25 April. And after Homonhon, the expedition proceeded to the nearby island called Mazawa or Limasawa, which was an island that served as a family hunting ground for two local chieftains who are brothers named Raja Kulambu and Raja Siawi. Through the help of a crew member whom Pigafetta referred to as Enrique de Malacca, serving as an interpreter, Magellan was able to converse with the natives, who exchanged gifts with him as a sign of friendship. One of the Rajas, Raja Kulambu, also sealed a friendship with Magellan through a blood compact, which is a common practice in the islands at that time, to manifest trust and goodwill. And 2 days after, on 31st of March, Pigafetta said that they held the first ever recorded Christian Mass in what is now the Philippines, together with the local chiefs and the natives to celebrate Easter Sunday. They also erected a cross at the highest point of the island before Magellan and his crew left on the 4th of April. So I mentioned about Enrique de Malacca. This is a Filipino artist's depiction of him, obviously a romanticized portrait of how he looks like. He was a servant or slave of Magellan, whom he captured and brought to Europe in an earlier voyage to the Malacca in present-day Malaysia by taking the eastern route in 1511. Magellan brought him along to serve as an interpreter because his mother tongue was Malay. And as I mentioned, he was able to converse with the natives of Limasawa, which again proves that Malay was widespread in Southeast Asia during that time. Some have said that because he came from Malacca and Magellan brought him to Europe via the eastern route, and then returned to the region via the western route, he may be considered as the first person to have circumnavigated the globe. But after abandoning the expedition when it reached the island of Cebu, the next stop of the voyage, nothing was ever heard of him again. If he stayed in the Philippines or he returned to his original place of residence. So when Magellan was in Limasawa, he inquired from the local chief, Raja Kulambu, which ports he could get the best provisions for his ships. And Raja Kulambu directed him to Cebu, the island of Cebu. And Raja Kulambu also volunteered to serve as his guide in reaching the place. And so on the 7th of April, the expedition met Raja Humabon of Cebu. Pigafetta said that they visited him at his royal residence, and he was introduced, Magellan was introduced to him by Raja Kulambu. At that time, the island of Cebu was already a major center for the trading of goods. And in fact, Magellan and Raja Humabon exchanged gifts as a token of friendship. Pigafetta likewise wrote that Magellan offered the protection of Spain from rival kingdoms in the region, which Raja Humabon accepted. Pigafetta also noted that the Raja Humabon was considered as the paramount ruler by various local chiefs of the island, so the whole island, except for one chief, a local chief here, in the nearby island of Mactan. And his name is Raja Lapu-Lapu. But aside from swearing allegiance to the sovereignty of the Spanish king, Raja Humabon also converted to Christianity and was baptized with his wife. A Catholic Mass was also held during that time to celebrate their conversion to Christianity. Now, knowing that the ruler of the island of Mactan, Lapu-Lapu, refused to recognize Raja Humabon as the paramount ruler in the region and to swear allegiance to Spain, at the suggestion of Raja Humabon, Magellan ordered his crew to sail to the island of Mactan in order to force his chief, Lapu-Lapu, to comply with his orders. Magellan also saw this as an opportunity to show Raja Humabon and the local chiefs how his men fight in battle. And so on the fateful day of 27 April 1521, that's 500 years ago and 1 month from today, Magellan and his crew, accompanied by Raja Humabon and his men, sailed to Mactan. This is not the actual scene of the battle, but again, a Filipino artist's depiction through a painting that has been romanticized in various Filipino films and stories. The succeeding slides will show you the full account of Pigafetta from his own chronicles of what transpired in the Battle of Mactan. Pigafetta related that a small group of 60 men, remember 60 men only, went with Magellan and arrived in Mactan 3 hours before daylight, so that's dawn. And since it was too early to fight, he asked his men to send word to Lapu-Lapu to give him a choice to recognize the Spanish king and offer tribute, or learn the hard way how their lances pierced. But Mactan's defiant reply was that they said they had lances of bamboo and stakes hardened with fire as well that could kill. And so Magellan brought with him 49 of his men ashore, as their ships could not get near the shore because of the rocky outcropping. The shore was full of rock, so they had to lay anchor farther from the shore. So they had to get down, and they were immediately confronted by more than 1,000 strong warriors of Lapu-Lapu. And upon landing, Magellan's small force was immediately attacked by the natives and surrounded them, attacking them from the front and both flanks. While all the battles were happening, Raja Humabon, the chief of Cebu, offered his help, no? But Magellan refused. Said, "Don't worry, we can do this." And in hoping to ease the attack, no, Magellan told his men to set fire some of the houses, no, near the shore. But this only enraged the natives even more. And Pigafetta relates that Magellan was shot through the right leg with a poisoned arrow because their legs apparently were not protected by metal plates, only the head and the body. No? And so Pigafetta wrote, recognizing the captain, so many turned upon him that they knocked his helmet off his head twice. But he always stood firmly like a good knight together with some others. No? And Pigafetta further recounted that a bamboo lance flew near Magellan's place, and he responded by killing the enemy, leaving the lance in his victim. But a large javelin was thrust into his left leg, making him fall face down in the water until they killed our mirror, our light, our comfort, and our true guide. That is his own exact words. And after Magellan and 8 of his men were killed, Pigafetta and the remaining crew managed to return to their ships and sailed back to Cebu. Some historians have posited the view that Magellan committed a fatal mistake by meddling into local politics and not recognizing the dynamics of a local power play. Some also say that he is a brilliant sailor and explorer, but he is not a good military strategist, unfortunately. Obviously, 60 men against 1,000 strong warriors who knew the local terrain is a extreme disadvantage. Magellan's remains were left behind after the battle. No? Today, there is this Magellan shrine in the island of Mactan where it's believed that his body was buried. And if you will notice from Pigafetta's account, there was hardly any mention of Lapu-Lapu. Where was he during the Battle of Mactan? We don't even know if he actually fought in the battle, or perhaps he just watched on the sidelines and directed his men to fight the battle. No? And as I mentioned earlier, this is one of the challenges of writing history. The accounts we have are only those that were recorded by Pigafetta and some other survivors of the expedition. There are no written accounts from the early Filipinos, so we do not know their side of the story. Because of the bravery shown by the men of Lapu-Lapu, some Filipino historians depicted him as strong and muscular warrior, as shown in the left photo. Some recent studies, however, suggest that he was already 70 years old when the Battle of Mactan happened, as shown in the right photo. And some have also said that he was originally actually from Sabah, and returned there to retire. But we will never really know with absolute certainty without any written evidence to support that claim. After the Battle of Mactan, another tragedy struck the expedition. They went back to Cebu, and on the 1st of May, Raja Humabon hosted a banquet for the expedition, which ended up in a massacre of about 30 members of the crew. Pigafetta claimed that Enrique de Malacca, the great Enrique de Malacca, was partly responsible for the incident. He had persuaded Raja Humabon to harm the Spaniards so he could escape and be freed from slavery. Because there was a last will of testament apparently by Magellan that upon his death he should be freed, but the captains of the expedition did not allow him to abandon or to leave the ship. Another account, however, from an anonymous crew that was documented by a Portuguese historian claims that it was Lapu-Lapu who persuaded Raja Humabon to kill the Spaniards. Otherwise, the people of Mactan would attack Cebu. At the same time, another group of historians offers the viewpoint that it is more logical to suppose that it was the result of the loss of prestige at Mactan that made Raja Humabon and his allies believe that white men were not invincible and that there was no point of continuing a friendship that they did not relish. And so they immediately left Cebu. Oh, before they left Cebu, actually they passed through here in Bohol, where Pierre has his own house. Here, where they set on fire and burned Concepcion, I think, because they already had very few members of the crew. Nobody could man the vessel anymore, so they had to abandon it, burn it here. I think it's near your house. So they immediately left Cebu and passed through other islands in central Philippines, no? Until they reached Palawan, here, which Pigafetta described as a promised land because they suffered great hunger before they found it, no? And from there they were able to replenish their food and supplies, no? And then they also laid anchor in a place called Tagusao in Palawan, which Pigafetta described as inhabited by Muslims who were ruled from Borneo, no? Obviously referring to Brunei. And after talking to the inhabitants, they learned of a great kingdom in the south ruled by a powerful sultan. So because of that, they went to Brunei. But Christian will talk about that more later. And from Brunei, they went back again to Palawan, and they sailed northeast to Palawan until they reached Mindanao, no? And Pigafetta described Maguindanao as a large city, most likely describing the seat of the Sultanate of Maguindanao, where Cotabato is located, no? One of the chiefs they encountered there in the city offered his services to the expedition as a pilot, no? In going to the Maluku, the Spice Islands, which the crew accepted. And so this is the circuitous route, no? That the expedition took from Guam to the islands, again, central Philippines, Brunei, back to the Philippines, and finally to the Spice Islands. Dr. Rommel mentioned a while ago about his dilemma, no? On the commemoration of this milestone event, no? in global history. For the Philippines, we have chosen the theme Victory and Humanity. It is victory not because Magellan met his tragic end in the hands of our ancestors, but a victory because the Philippines was able to play and contribute a role in a watershed moment in world history, the discovery that the world is round and not flat. Science and navigation advanced from that achievement, no? Initiated by the Europeans, and from there ideas and knowledge blossomed everywhere and revolutionized the quality of life of people around the world. For the Philippines, we have chosen to emphasize the hospitality and generosity by our ancestors to the expedition when they first arrived in our shores. After all, there might not have been a circumnavigation without our ancestors' offer of food and water to the Europeans at Homonhon Island, as well as replenishing the ship's provisions from local sources, thus ensuring the continuation of their journey to reach the Spice Islands and eventually return to Europe. After the Magellan voyage, it will take another 50 or so years before the Spaniards would eventually colonize most parts of the islands that now comprise the Philippines, and exercise control over the country for 333 years. And I often wonder where the Philippines would be now if Magellan did not stumble into our shores. Probably we would have continued to be under the influence of Brunei, the Sultanate of Brunei, and became a Muslim nation as well. Or perhaps colonized by other imperial powers during that time. Who knows? France. We would have been French-speaking. But then again, that is a job for fortune tellers and not diplomats like us. And you cannot change the course of history. And I believe that we as a people shape our own destiny as a nation. So thank you very much for your kind attention.
Amin. Donc maintenant je vais terminer le voyage. Donc moi j'avais parlé de l'île qui était Guam. Et après Guam, il y a eu les Philippines. Et ensuite, donc, l'ambassadeur a parlé de Brunei. On va descendre, descendre, hop, on descend encore. Ouais, voilà, un peu plus haut, voilà, c'est bon, Brunei. Donc, merci. Donc, arrivé au Brunei le 8 juillet. Ça, c'est une carte de Pigafetta. Le nord, en fait, est ici. Et donc, si on tourne la carte, eh bien, en fait, on reconnaît bien. Hein. Alors, on voit les deux rivières. Ça, c'est peut-être là où il y a les Pulau Morabeza, où il y a les Chinois, et puis de la Boane. On reconnaît. Et surtout, ils n'ont aucune idée de la grandeur de Bornéo. En fait, Pigafetta dit qu'il a entendu dire qu'en bateau, il faut 3 semaines pour faire le tour de Bornéo. Donc ils imaginent que c'est très grand, mais ils ne savent pas exactement la taille. En tout cas, ils sont accueillis à Brunei par une délégation on voit que les habits sont très très riches. Hein. Le dessin de l'Empire est pas mal, il est assez proche. Donc Pigafetta appelle Brunei Bornei. C'était la prononciation. C'est assez proche de Bornéo. Et le sultan donc en fait le sultan s'appelle Raja Sripida, mais c'est le sultan Bolkiah, le 5e sultan du Brunei. Et voilà ce que dit Pigafetta, une grande ville avec une grande baie, et dans cette baie il y a beaucoup de bancs. Ça n'a pas beaucoup changé finalement. Et ils sont très surpris parce que par rapport aux Philippines, compared to the Philippines, Brunei has a high level of civilization regarding the houses, regarding the way people are dressed. Et il appelle les habitants les Maures. Moros, à l'époque, ça veut dire les musulmans, the Muslims. Et Pigafetta écrit, j'ai son livre, il dit These Moros worship Mahomet. The letters law ordered them not to eat pork, etc., etc. So he is a sociologist at the same time, Pigafetta. C'est une grande ville, 25 000 foyers par rapport à ce qu'ils ont vu auparavant, c'est beaucoup. Et les maisons sont sur bois, sur pilotis, c'est comme pour ailleurs, ça n'a pas changé, nothing has changed. Voilà. Donc le journal de Pigafetta est vraiment très intéressant. C'est vraiment un guide de voyage du tour du monde en 3 ans. Voilà. Et il décrit le Brunei comme ayant des centaines et des centaines de bateaux. À l'époque, le Brunei est un empire. L'époque où Magellan, c'est pas Magellan qui arrive aux Philippines. C'est un empire maritime qui a été décrit donc par l'ambassadeur. Et après le Brunei, ce sont les Moluques, ils achètent des épices et ils repartent. Donc ils sont à Timor en 1522, puis c'est le Cap de Bonne-Espérance au sud de l'Afrique. Ils s'arrêtent au Cap Verde, donc, qui est une possession portugaise. Alors là, il y a des problèmes parce que c'est un bateau espagnol, il y a des Portugais, soucis, il y a des gens qui sont faits prisonniers. Voilà. Et finalement, ils arrivent en Espagne. Ils sont partis, en fait, je n'ai pas marqué, mais il manque 3 semaines. 3 semaines de plus, et c'était exactement 3 ans. Voilà. 3 ans de voyage. Il y a 18 survivants sur 270. Donc ça veut dire que 10 survivants, c'est 8% of survivors. Alors parmi eux, il y a Sébastien Elcano, il y a notamment Pigafetta, heureusement, parce qu'il va écrire le journal en italien, c'est traduit en français et ensuite c'est diffusé. Parmi les survivants et surtout les Espagnols, puisque c'était les plus nombreux, il y a un Français sur 17 qui s'appelle Richard de Normandie, dans le Pigafetta l'appelle Ricardo de Normandia, et c'est un charpentier, un carpenter. Donc voilà, la conséquence de ce voyage, ben voilà, on sait qu'on peut partir d'ici, aller plein ouest, descendre tout en bas, traverser pendant 3 mois, et ensuite on atteint les Mariannes, ensuite les Philippines, et on redescend le Cap de Bonne-Espérance, et on remonte. Donc ça c'est une carte du 18e siècle à peu près. Voilà le voyage de manière plus précise. avec les dates. Donc 3 ans de voyage et plus de 92% de pertes. Mais aux Moluques, ils ont pu acheter des épices et un seul bateau sur 5 revient. Et avec ces épices sur un seul bateau, le voyage est remboursé. Donc on imagine s'il y avait eu 5 bateaux. Hein. Only one ship out of 5 and full of spices. And with these spices, the voyage has been reimbursed. Alors les conséquences de ce voyage, donc c'est la première circumnavigation, je ne reviens pas. Donc l'Amérique du Sud, South America is a huge continent. Ils pensaient qu'en quelques mois, ils pouvaient descendre, trouver un passage, et ça prend beaucoup plus de temps. Le détroit de Magellan, c'est une découverte très importante géographique, puisque jusqu'à la construction du canal de Panama, les bateaux passeront par le détroit de Magellan, pendant donc à peu près presque 400 ans. On découvre que le Pacifique, il ne faut pas 3 semaines pour atteindre les Moluques à partir du détroit de Magellan. It doesn't take 3 weeks from the Magellan Strait to reach the Moluques. It takes 3 months. Les mers sont toutes connectées, donc à part la mer Caspienne et tout, mais toutes les mers, Méditerranée, Pacifique, Atlantique, la Manche. Donc ça veut dire qu'on va pouvoir naviguer sur la Terre entière. En fait, la planète Terre devrait plutôt s'appeler la planète mer. Et c'est le début, hein, même si on l'a vu, c'est le début de l'expansion européenne, parce que les Européens savent qu'ils peuvent aller partout dans le monde avec des bateaux, que en gros les peuples qu'ils visitent ont des lances et non pas des fusils. Alors certes, on peut mourir à cause de lances, comme Magellan à la bataille de Mactan, mais en tout cas, voilà. Ce qui est intéressant, c'est que le voyage de l'expédition, la visite de Elcano à Brunei, n'a pas eu de conséquences sur le pays. The arrival of Elcano in Brunei had no consequences on the history of Brunei, different with the Philippines or with Malacca or with Malaysia. Donc, ça peut être considéré comme la toute première globalisation. Et surtout, ça diffuse au sein des Européens cet esprit d'aventure, de découverte, spirit of discovery, spirit of adventure, qui va s'étendre pendant à peu près 400 ans. Et d'ailleurs, le premier télescope spatial, the first space telescope, was named by the American Magellan, because it's exploration of unknown territories. On doit en terminer. Voilà. Thank you. Bon, si vous avez des questions, naturellement. Il faut savoir que on parlait des sources. Quand Elcano arrive au Brunei, il n'est pas le premier Européen à venir au Brunei. Les premiers Européens venus au Brunei sont des Portugais en 1505. Et après la bataille de Malacca, 1505, the first Portuguese came to Brunei. And in 1514, 3 years after the fall of Malacca, several Portuguese ships came to Brunei. Voilà.
I have a question. Are any of you aware whether Brunei is going to do any kind of commemoration?
Yes.
After this?
Tomorrow.
But
UBD.
on the day, not on July
No.
8th.
At the initiative of
It's a
Christian.
non-event here.
It's another.
It's a non-event for several reasons. As I said, the arrival of the Magellan Expedition had absolutely no consequences in the country. I don't think there is something in the local sources, Malay sources, I'm not sure. I don't think so. And so it's a non-event. And in Spain and Portugal, it's very interesting. So 5 years ago, so they were thinking about the commemoration of the 500th year anniversary of the Magellan Expedition. So is it a Spanish expedition? Is it a Portuguese expedition? They fought, they struggled, it became diplomatic, it became politics. Yeah. And then they said, okay, let's have a Spanish-Portuguese. So I don't know in the Spanish and Portuguese couple how it works. We have a Spanish-Portuguese couple here. So, but yes, it's a non-event. So the only event will be initiated by us tomorrow at UBD. We have the same lecture.
Actually, just to add to that, I think Christian, we talk about it
only about early this year, inquiring whether there's something that they're. Then I said, no, we can come up with something, no, jointly, because Spain is not here, and you're representing EU here. And Philippines, of course, it's very significant consequence to us. So the result of that is this one, the lecture here at the Alliance, and also
Yes,
the
it's
lecture
a
at UBD.
Euro-Asian lecture. That's what I really appreciate. Ok? Oui. Bohol, oui, Bohol, la maison de Bohol.
I'm quite worried now. In fact, it shows that it is the first circumnavigation around the world because we have all the written evidence. But are we aware from the Chinese side of any prior or previous explorer who could have done or who could have made this?
No. The Chinese, for sure, they went to the eastern coast of Africa. That's for sure. 100 years before Magellan, they had a big expedition by Admiral Cheng He. That was a 1420 something, 1425. A huge expedition with hundreds of ships with 25,000 sailors. We're talking about 270 sailors. Talking about 25,000 sailors on ships. These ships were 100 meters long. A carack or a caravel is 30 meters, so it's different. But at that time, after there were several Cheng He expeditions, and after the third or fourth one, the Emperor of China said, I don't want any Chinese ship. So it was forbidden to the Chinese ships, merchant or whatever, to leave the coast, not the China Sea, what we call now the China Sea. But it, at the time was called I don't know what the name, we found different names. But it was forbidden for the Chinese to leave the coast of China. So no, for sure, the Chinese never explored the world. No. The Pacific Ocean only, all these people from Tahiti, Hawaii, came from this region of the world, from Indonesia, from Asia. It's proved by the DNA, it's proved by the language, it's proved by,
Let me say something about that. There is actually a book published in 2004 by Gavin Menzies, 1421,
he
that
pretends.
supposedly reached the Americas, the Chinese. But this is a very controversial book. Has a lot of criticisms and debunkings of what he was saying. But he and his group, there are also his supporters, and they up to the time when Menzies died last year, they were still turning in, discussing about it, looking for evidences of this. Because one thing that they were thinking was, because of the prohibitions by the emperor after sometime in 1423, they destroyed all this kind of evidences, those kind of documents relating to Genus Expedition. So there is nothing that can be said on their side. So they're still looking for that, and the rest of the world are very wary of this kind of ideas because the implications are dire. So, but you see, it's still ongoing kind of thing.
Yeah.
In Europe, for sure, the Earth was flat. We agree, and since the Greek knows already that the Earth was round, but we have to wait for Galilei to understand that the world was round. But what about Asia? What was the feeling in Asia? Was the Earth was flat in Asia before or no?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not really sure.
We haven't ventured that far.
No. Next lecture.
I wouldn't be surprised. The astronomical knowledge in China and in India is quite impressive. But I'm not sure exactly whether they really thought the world as flat or...
Is there any reference in any books or any writing about that? About this situation of the Earth?
I'm not sure. I cannot say anything about that for now. Yeah, but that's an interesting thing. Or probably it didn't really matter to them whether the world was flat or not. Probably it is a particular need among Europeans to talk about it.
Yeah, because the Chinese at the time they didn't have this sense of curiosity, this spirit of discovery. They didn't want to explore the world. The European they had it because, as I described, the spirit of the Renaissance. We need to discover new things in all fields: medicines, arts, even art, science and navigation. The Chinese at that time, the astronomers in Beijing at the court of the Emperor of China were from Italy, from Spain, were in fact European. And in Beijing you can see the replica of the different globe and stuff. Was built by Jesuits, priests at the court of the Emperor of China. They didn't have this need that the European had in the Renaissance times.
The Genus Expedition is really an interesting episode because that's rather it sets a very different tone in the course of Chinese history, because Chinese history they tend to be inward looking. They're very much concerned about protecting themselves against the northern barbarians and all. So they're not very keen about exploring other areas. Genus Expedition in 1405 onwards, that's the only thing that, and it's a very impressive kind of expedition with hundreds of ships that can easily dwarf European ships. And they reach as far as East African coast and all. So you'd see, if they manage to do that, then they have the navigational skills to do it. And the ships are huge, and there's a series of things that they did. So that is a rather an exception to the general pattern in Chinese history, that they tended to look within rather than explore outside. Yeah.
Elodie? Donc voilà, très bien. Donc maintenant. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.